Let's get started. Welcome
Welcome.
in. Oh, we're
Uh,
creating a culture of welcome.
yes.
Join us.
Welcome, everybody. Well, we're here, the dynamic duo here. I'm Heather MacArthur. If you haven't sat in one of these webinars, we haven't met before through the work that we do.
And my name is Gerri Brehm, and the same. If we have not had a chance to meet before, lovely to meet you now. And hello to all the folks that we do know. It's great to see familiar names drop into the participant list. So thanks so much for being here.
And as we're doing this, this is a webinar, but feel free to use the Q&A section if you want to send us questions. We're happy to answer those throughout. But we will dive into the building meaningful culture. Just to give you a little bit of a setup, Gerri and I, through the work that we're doing, we often see a lot of useful tips, really practical tips around how do you build a culture, but we find that sometimes it's the, oh, we're going to put our values together. We're going to do all these things that are the right things to do, and they show up on a glossy kind of laminated thing that gets sent to all the offices, or it's brought up one time at the beginning of the year, but it really doesn't sink into what it means to work and what it feels like to work in that organization. So we thought we would dive in a little bit deeper.
Yes. And it's obviously something that's going around because this morning, Harvard Business Review, I get their daily alert, and one of their articles today was just about how do leaders actually embed culture. And so we'll talk a little bit about that as well. But one of the things I, I have found is that, as Heather says, we get these values laid out, and a lot of times I see them on the career tab of like, come join us because we're this kind of company. But then you start talking to them and you realize, oh, but that's not how people are showing up on a day-to-day basis. So it really is, we have a couple examples here, like how do people show up and talk to each other during crunch time? How respectful are they to each other in terms of how they're having those communications on a day-to-day basis? But also, more importantly, I think how do they talk about each other when they're not in the room? And that willingness, or what's the comfort level of being uncomfortable in conversations, like that true version of psychological safety of we can actually bump up against each other in a respectful way. And then ultimately, how open is leadership to taking feedback? And the article I just mentioned today called out this one that was, what's a leader willing to sort of spend, if you will? What's the cost of living to their values? So what will they let go of if it means they actually are showing up based on what they say their company stands for? And that one hit me pretty hard.
Yeah, I like that because I think there's the, the conversation I often have is like we do the brainstorm and this is what we want and these are the values and this is what matters and this all makes sense. And then it's the discussion of, usually, and those of you that are in HR, this exercise, stop, start, continue. What are we going to stop? What are we going to start? Once again, I'm not dismissing that because it's all good stuff. But then there's this like, okay, but what is it really going to take to make that shift? And some of the things I'm going to actually kind of come back to a little bit of what you're talking about of how do you tell what the real workplace culture is? Because there's a few things that I look for, which now I hope no one's going to get weirded out of like if I'm working with you, like is Heather looking at these things? I am, but don't worry about it. But I do in meetings when I'm working with a team, especially a team that's worked together for a while. I'm looking for, I call it the flock of bird situation of does it feel like the conversation kind of flows and there is a little bit of build off of what someone said, there's some interruption, but it doesn't feel antagonistic. I think that's the obvious one, but also what's not as obvious is when I've got into teams that they've worked together for a while, they're not new to each other, and they're all taking very polite turns. And I get that there's some culture to that in terms of regional culture of maybe, what's that country's kind of trends and that type of thing. But there is something of you're that formal with each other and you've been around each other that long, and there's not any kind of natural build off or build on where it's like, Gerri, if you and I were talking, it would be I say something and then there's a pause, you go next, but you're not building off of what I've said. You're talking about something completely different. And so there's this separateness that kind of shows up in the way the dialogue shows up. And I think it's an interesting one to look out that I don't see a lot of people call out.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll even go back to that idea of circling back to, what's a leader going to cost? Because I flashed on somebody that I knew who had started a business, and I won't use his language, but they had a no jerk policy. Don't just call it jerks.
Yeah, okay.
So you are not allowed to act or behave like a jerk with each other within the company. Makes sense. And they would call people out and they would hold you accountable for that. But he also had a no jerk policy for their partners. So this was a very creative space and there was a lot of energy and personalities in it. But they also didn't want it from their clients. And they literally put it in their contracting that you couldn't behave these way, in this way, couldn't be a jerk. Their language, though, was different. And when we talk about what's the cost of that, he was telling me how they had to fire a client and they basically pulled out the contract and said, we said this was not allowed. And he said, this is 6-digit numbers in terms of what people spend for what his company does. And that's saying we're putting that money out. You can take it back. You're like, this is what we refund to you because we're not going to work with you. And I think that moment just had everybody in the company just wake up and go, oh yeah, that's what this really means. This is when we are living what we say we are as a culture.
That's an amazing visual of it because now that you're saying the cost thing, like where is the money getting spent and where's the time getting spent? And I think that's the thing, for how long we've seen some shifts, but for how long and probably still pretty existent in some organizations where it's the person really hits a lot of dollar amounts or they hit all the deadlines. And they're like, oh yeah, but they're kind of jerks. They leave a lot of bodies in the wake, but look at all the money that they're producing for us. Like, well, you just got to deal with them. They're unique, they're neurotic, whatever they want to label it, but there's a lot of behavior that's just kind of dismissed. It made me think, I just saw a post on LinkedIn from Gary V or Gary Vaynerchuk, and I like the point that he makes. He talks about like he'd rather have, I'm probably going to misquote a little bit, but he'd rather have an A+ person in kindness with like a B- in capability because you can train that versus A+ in productivity but C+ in kindness because the amount of damage that will be done. And I feel like now, especially with like HRIS departments that are tracking data and feedback from employees, that you're getting more and more now that we're able to put a cost to what happens in the organization when the culture is toxic or unhealthy. I mean, there's so many other kind of things that we can notice, but I'm gonna jump to, what's the role of the individual and leader? And Gerri and I were having this conversation a couple days ago. And there's this thing of I think where the leader is, so goes the culture. That what they care about, what they tend to kind of buy into, what they don't buy into, how they show up. So much of the culture is wrapped around that. And Gerri made I think a very good call out of, but it's not just the individual. And Gerri, I don't know if you want to pipe in a little bit on that.
Well, we have this idea, and I've worked with companies where we talk about, what do you say your culture is, but then how does it actually show up? What are the repeated and predictable behaviors? And sometimes even those repeated and predictable behaviors are better than what they have on their website because people just love being there and they love what they are able to create within that organization. But in a lot of cases, that's obviously not what's going on. And so they talk about what it is, but that every individual has a chance to show up and reinforce what is working in the organization. They have a chance to sort of help set and move culture in the right direction. To your point, it starts from the top. What do they say? If the head of the fish stinks or something like that.
Ah, I haven't heard that, but that sounds good.
There's something about it, it starts at the top. And that's true. That said, because so many organizations are structured in a way that you can have your own little bubble, your own little pocket.
Yeah.
So you do have a sense as individuals, we get to create, this is our culture, and this is how we fit and we support what the organization is trying to accomplish.
It makes me think of a story. I was actually talking about this with a client earlier this week, just as an example, because she was struggling with, she was new into the organization. She was trying to change and shift a lot of things that people had been complaining about. It's part of the reason that she got hired. And she was just getting just nothing but resistance from her team. And it made me, I was trying to help her have compassion for her team because I remember in my 20s, just last year, I was in a situation where there was a lot of toxic stuff going on in the organization. I had a manager who she was honestly a really good manager, good conversations. We were kind of in the trenches together. And then her manager, they hired in a new person. And he came to meet with all of us and do kind of that new leader assimilation thing. And I was, new in my career. I had maybe a year or two out of the military, and in the military, as much as you'd think like, oh, you can only talk to people a certain way, there's a lot of bluntness that in the air environment that I was in, and I could kind of go, oh, with all due respect, sir or ma'am, and then just go, here's what I think. Um, and in this situation, he came in and he's doing the new leader simulation. And I'm just like, well, here's all the things that are wrong, blah, blah. And it was professional. It's not like I was out there just, trash and everything, but I was being listing all the problems. And after the meeting, and I thought this is one of the best moments, worst moments, best moments. And my manager pulled me aside and she said, I get it. It has sucked. And I've been here with you, but we just had an opportunity to build something new and you missed it. And I kind of, because I was coming in with this idea of, well, you're the leader now. What are you going to do? What are you going to do to fix it? And not realizing, like, well, how am I showing up and contributing to this? And so that's why I loved when you called it, because that's what I started thinking about is that idea that culture is always co-created. The leader has so much power and influence. So if they're going to stand out, they do have a sway on this, but the individuals tend to have the numbers. And so how you show up is contributing, like you said, or reinforcing on things.
I think there's also, it's easy to abdicate out of, well, they said the culture is this, but that's not what they're doing. So it's not, what am I supposed to do? Just as, the little pawn in this bigger thing. And like, no, every single one of us shows up and make choices about how we show up.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, I like this last point that we have here of culture always exists, whether you intentionally create it or not. So I think there's also the question of, oh, do we need to talk about culture? I'm gonna see, I'm a storyteller. This is my culture. Um, but there was a leader who came in at some point in my career, and I remember I went to go talk to him because I was, I liked him quite a bit. I thought he was doing a great job. He was coming in with that kind of the right positivity. We were coming out of a really negative time frame. And I went to talk to him about, hey, here's some things some nuances that you may not be aware of, and be great if we can kind of tackle these things. And I remember he was like, "Oh, Heather, I was hoping you weren't one of them." And I was like, "Wait, well, what's one of them?" And he was like, can't we all just show up to work and just do our jobs? And, like, why does this have to all be orchestrated? And I just thought, oh, you don't want to lead an organization. You want to be in charge of some stuff and have a lot of helping hands. And the idea of the responsibility of a leader and the building of things, I think sometimes people miss that, or the intentionality of building a team and what's that going to be about. There is just this level of, I think it's all going to happen organically. And what it is they were really good. In his case, he's coming from a marketing environment and then coming into HR, and he was really good at those things. But the idea of having to actually, I think he got lucky and had worked with some teams that just were naturally or maybe built by other leaders. And when he stepped in, they were ready to go. And I find it fascinating when people struggle or resist being intentional about how do we want to treat each other? How do we want to show up? What's going to be expected?
And I think, culture does happen organically. It just may not be the culture you were planning on.
Fair point. Fair point. Yeah, and that's in art and that culture, there was a lot of good stuff, but there was silos and there were some little fiefdoms that were there that was, I wasn't like going in there and going like, oh, you need to go talk to so and so. And it was more of like, there's just some missed opportunities. And now that there was a leader, and I kind of saw him as like, oh, you're coming in to do some good stuff, maybe think about this. And it wasn't even so much, I mean, he could have shot my ideas down by any means, but it was just more he's shooting down the idea of being intentional and dialoguing about this in general. So I think that's a mistake that some people make. To your point, it's going to show up, and it can show up organically, and you might get lucky. I think a lot of people come from being lucky, and when they hit the roadblock, they don't know how to build it, whether that's individuals, how to build talent and skills in your team, or just the team in general and how it operates. Well, since we're yapping about how to be intentional, I guess we better come to the table with some ideas. Um, So how do you build it intentionally? I think there is something about you have to discuss what it means because it's so unique to everybody and to every organization. I'm calling out healthy culture, and even that to a certain extent is a bit of my bias, my perspective. Some people might say, how do you build a productive culture? I don't know what would be the bias, but I tend to focus on healthy. What are your thoughts on that?
I guess does come down to being really specific on what that definition is, whether it's productive or healthy or inclusive or whatever language you use. But I think also then, okay, so this is me. Try not to be Debbie Downer, but I am going to be the person who's like, I see the other side. That for every great word you put up there, now think about the implications of that.
Mm,
So I think about somebody's like, oh, we're a family oriented company. We're all family. Okay. Um, so at next Thanksgiving, go ahead and fire your uncle. But it's a sense of you're going to probably have to at some point let somebody go in your organization. And that is in direct conflict with this family vibe you're going for.
mm.
Others might just say, no, we're just a high performance organization and we're a strong, high functioning team. Right. But there could be some folks in your team that just like, all right, but I'm a little bit of a cog. So you get some other high functioning person in here and I could be swapped out. So there's not maybe the cohesion that you might want on a team that quote unquote feels like their family. So I think, again, to say we're really inclusive. Okay, but what about that time somebody isn't part of the conversation? So I just think it's really what does a definition look like and then really be thoughtful and intentional of and how does that play out? Think of the worst case scenarios and again, what are we leaving on the table? What's the price we're willing to pay to live to this?
That's actually surfacing something that I think is important that's not on the slide is that I think as a team, you have to first get clear as to why do we exist as a team? So, a lot of times when we start to talk about building culture, it's kind of what our preferences are. Like my preferences on there is this idea of healthy because I think of healthy as in healthy productivity in terms of the company is healthy and growing, but also as the individual. But that's a preference. The reality is why are we together? Like why is the company paying for us to operate as a unit? Or why does the company exist if you're doing it on that level? What is the reason? And no matter what, there is a business reason for existing. And I think sometimes when people talk about culture, maybe this is why some people don't want to have those conversations and do the planning, is it gets for lack of a better term, the touchy feelies and like, oh, I want it to feel this way and that way. But then they're like, well, okay, but we got to get work done. So what is that about? And so I think if you start with what's our reason for existing? Because to your point, a family exists because you know, for most part, most people, it's like, well, we're, connected to each other biologically, and somehow the cards played out, and I was born into this family. And then maybe as an adult, you decide whether you're going to stay or not. But there is kind of an organicness of how that gets built, and not everybody opts in on their own. And so, with a team and a business, there is a reason that you exist, but I don't know if everyone's always clear as to why that is. I mean, I know that I always sat in HR organizations or learning and development teams, and I think they go like, well, that's our function, so that's why we exist. No, 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 no. Why does this company in particular, how is it leveraging, HR? What is it? How do we want it to leverage HR? So there's a little bit of what are we trying to create and what's showing up for us, and how do we do that? And I think when you set that up and you're clear about it, then you can sit back and go, then what kind of environment is going to set that up for success? What should it feel like? How should others feel? And, are we in the business of having to be really innovative and risk taking? Well, the culture's got to look very different than an organization that's all about compliance and quality assurance. Like
Yeah.
those are very different business reasons for existing.
Yeah. But I think to your point, if you've got that clarity on the why, then all these next and the established expectations become easier because then it's really clear like this is what problem solving looks like if this is our why, or this is how we're going to make decisions to be, again, whether it's innovation or compliance, like you've got clarity of how you're going to be doing it because that why is so clear.
Yeah. And I think doing a deep dive on that and not I'll double down on not assuming it's obvious. Oh, we work in IT, so of course it's obvious. Like, no, it's actually not. Every organization is going to be different. Every department's going to be different. Every year might be different, to be honest. Like it might shift. Um, and then I think we want to call out this inside out, as we're saying, we don't want the culture to just kind of sit on top of what the real culture is. The beginning part of this is all kind of let's get clear on what we want, but then let's get clear about what we need to change that. And as Gerri mentioned before, the cost, some of the things that are not necessarily the financial cost, and it's touches on financial, is how do we do the development so that people are capable of committing to what that culture is supposed to look like. And um, I think some of the main things that people miss out on is self-awareness. And that's a tough one. That's a tough one because people show up and they've all got their own levels. We all come in with how we grew up, how we've navigated life, and we're not supposed to be each other's therapists. But calling out emotional intelligence, self-awareness being a key part of emotional intelligence, of because it's very hard to build culture with someone who's not willing to examine and doesn't have the capacity to understand why they do what they do, because it gets so much harder to change behavior. Because even if they change it on the surface, if their brain is mapped to something and belief system, it's going to show, like maybe I remember I always think of the leader who I said at one point of like, yeah, I think there's some issue between us. And I'd love to work that through a little bit. And I've noticed like in the meetings, you show up differently with me than you show up with others. And so because she heard meetings, the next meeting, she was making eye contact with me and she was doing all this stuff. And it was this very surface stuff. And, technically it was like, well, this is what I asked for, so I should be happy. But the minute the meeting was done, it was like, okay, I'm back in the hallway and it feels exactly the same way. And that felt pretty performative or weird or whatever it was because it was from the outside in. And I just think that if you don't have people who are willing to go or able to go, oh, this is how I think, this is how I operate, and do I want to think differently? It's really hard to build an authentic culture.
Yeah. I think also because in many cases, particularly those we get called in to coach, whatever behavior might not be working for them right now might have been their success strategy
Ah,
all the way up to that point, and sort of influencing the culture around them. So to them, it's like, why would I change this? It's been successful. It's like, oh, and as you say, we hold the mirror and defog it a little bit of like, it's not working now. And I think that's maybe that goes back to that intentionality of culture anyway. Like, is the culture still supporting that why? Is the culture the bedrock you think it is, or the framework people can easily refer back to when they're trying to do the tough stuff, whether it's self-awareness or
yeah.
have that psychological safety with their colleagues.
And that's, it kind of touches now onto accountability. Is that, okay, you came up with these words and these values, but if they're not being used in your day-to-day discussions, if you're not embedding them, whether as an individual or as a leader, if they don't show up in the dialogue, um, they're not going to be part of how people think and how people behave. And I think that's another missing piece that I see is that they're set and then they're never discussed again. And I was just working with a team and they had these wonderful things all listed and the purpose for why they exist, which all of it was necessary work. But I'm like, I don't buy that any of you talk like this. And so if it's not going to show up, then it's not going to live and breathe. And either you layer in this language and you start using it, which is entirely possible. We all pick up new slang and new words every single day, new acronyms. There's nothing wrong with layering in new words. Psychological safety is relatively a new term, several years old. Um, and now it's starting to show up in more organizations and they're talking about it. So if you use it, it starts to have a life to it. But if you don't use it and you only dust it off like during performance conversations or once a year when you're doing goal setting, then the whole point of this is to impact the way people think on a day-to-day basis, not just an event.
Think about a team that had an outside brand consulting firm come and tell them or help them create their internal brand, which was really basically culture work. And I then was circling back with them for another engagement about a year later, and I had all my notes about, oh, so is this still like, oh no, 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 that died. To your point, it was just a layering on top of them, not anything that came again organically from inside. Nothing was shifting based on some fancy, splashy, shiny labels.
Yeah, and I will say when it comes to the verbiage, I the fastest way to make this something that sticks is that the leader actually uses it in the conversations. And everybody using it will can shift, but a leader who doesn't use it means that okay, we're not actually buying into this. Um, I think I want to jump back because I kind of skipped over this. When we look at established expectations, calling out when we're talking about how is it going to be as a culture, how are we going to operate as a culture? The topics that we're calling out here are the ones that I've seen as the most critical because people go like, how should it feel to work there? That's fine. But when it comes to how do we problem solve? What is our approach to problem solving? What are we expecting? How deep are we going? How are we communicating? What does decision making look like? Okay, the person who owns the project is the final say, or whatever the roles and responsibilities. What does it mean to work as a team? How are we helping each other? And when is it completely appropriate to work separate? And then for me, the big one is how are we showing up when it comes to conflict? What are we committing to when it comes to conflict? There's more in there, but those are the ones that I feel like sometimes we're so tactical, we miss this relationship side of how are we going to work the rules of engagement around working together.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, I want to call out this last one, ongoing and candid dialogue. We've had sessions on performance management, but this idea around it's not just performance management, but it's around throughout the year. How are you having conversations? I prefer that there's some intentional ones that are booked throughout the year that kind of map out along a performance year. I think that sets up for a lot of kind of preventative situations, but also, how are you checking in with each other? How are you supporting one another? And the hard part here is you've got to have ongoing candid dialogue and something has to change out of that. I think that's the hard part is we could talk till we're blue in the face, but if nothing's going to change, and I know that I've had moments in my career where I'm having those conversations, I'm trying to move things to a better place, and I'm realizing this person's not going to change. And to your point, Gerri, there's a point where I can go, okay, but if I keep engaging the way that I am, I'm going to start practicing things that I don't like. So how do I show up in a culture and be a positive contribution? Then I have to change my mind about certain things if I'm going to stay contributing to this culture or go to another culture, whatever it might be. But I think we go back to like, I just want to touch on toxicity because we didn't talk too much about that, but a lot of times that's when culture, the topic culture gets brought up. And I see people kind of go like, well, what if I can't change it? I do think to a certain extent you have that option then. Change your expectations and maybe even why you're engaging in this and or realize that there's a different culture that you need to go find for yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that willingness to have, honestly, a conversation with yourself.
Yeah.
Just what I was referencing my friend who was leaving money on the table, like because that we don't want to work with somebody like that. That's sometimes the crux of what we're doing as individuals is this the culture for me? What am I sacrificing if I stay about my values or what I believe in? And can I live in this culture and still be my best self? Or do I need to opt out because this really isn't helping me thrive?
And the last little comment that I'll have on that is, and then we take the role of the leader. If you're struggling with how you're doing things, um, see if your company can invest in a coach for you. I think a lot of times people think of coaching as in someone else says that you need it, or it's because things are on fire. It's just the further up you go, the less that you have, the feedback, the candid feedback and the visibility. Because even if your manager is giving you candid feedback, they're not there every day. So to have a coach, to look at that, we're not just saying that because we're coaches, but that's where I think it's fascinating they do executive comp packages, and it used to be about the car. Do they get a gym membership? And I'm like, oh, I just wish everybody was required to go through coaching and get some support because they're just not getting that level of um, su- candid feedback, visibility, and the mirror to help them self-reflect and bounce ideas off of. And partner with your HR. Hopefully, HR is, setting up a great relationship with you. But I think we miss out a lot of times as leaders not engaging HR as a thought partner. And if you're HR, you can take this soundbite and send it to your leaders. Well, we just want to let you know that we are available to support you on Thought Partnership. Feel free to shoot us an email or give us a call. And we do needs assessment, we do team planning, designing strategy, strategic thinking, skill training, and then, of course, the coaching piece of it. But we're here to help. And like we said, if you really just want to do a quick chat, that's no charge. Just reach out to us, and we always benefit from learning a little bit more about the organization that you're in.
And so I'm going to encourage you to grab this QR code. and watch our LinkedIn space as well, that we've got upside down talent planning. It's building talent from the ground up, and that will be next month with Heather MacArthur on the 30th of September, 11:30 to 12 Pacific Standard Time. So this is the stuff that gets her out of bed in the morning because she's excited about this stuff. So don't miss out.
Yeah, hopefully, I know a lot of people are doing talent planning at this time and succession planning. And so just calling out what I've been seeing is kind of some misses and some best practices from organizations that we've worked with. So hope to see you there.
Got questions? You can drop that into chat. Happy to, or the Q&A. Happy to answer anything in these last 60 seconds. And thank you all for being here. We appreciate you joining us.
All right. One question that just came up, and we'll grab it really quickly, is how do you get your leader to be a little bit more bought into this um, if they're not engaged? Look, if there's engagement surveys, that's one of the best ways because I see leaders wake up like they've never woken up before with those if they're managed well. The other part of it is I'm not going to say that it's easy, but I think it's listening to their pain points of what are they complaining about and getting them to understand how much culture is contributing to a lot of their performance issues, resource allocation, all those types of things. A lot of that is happening because the culture isn't set up to really align and embed with that. That's a pretty simplistic answer, but that's where I've seen the most traction. All right,
Thank
folks.
you all.
Thank you, everybody. We'll see you at the next one.
Bye-bye.
Bye.